Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, por acompañarnos esta mañana. A nombre de la Escuela de Gobierno y Transformación Pública del Tecnológico de Monterrey, me da una enorme satisfacción y agradezco enormemente la oportunidad de presentarles aquí a nuestro distinguido invitado, el profesor Maurice McTigue, a la conferencia magistral de New Zealand Experience. Agradezco además muy especialmente la presencia del doctor Enrique Lozano Martínez, quien es subsecretario de Desarrollo Regional, quien está aquí en representación del gobernador del estado de Nuevo León, Jaime Rodríguez Calderón, y agradecemos también la presencia de todos quienes nos acompañan aquí de la comunidad del Tecnológico de Monterrey. Como ustedes saben, la conferencia del día de hoy se llevará a cabo en el idioma inglés, pasaré a ese idioma para dar pie a la presentación de nuestro distinguido invitado. It is undoubtedly a remarkable pleasure for Tecnológico de Monterrey and for its School of Government and Public Transformation to welcome Professor Maurice McTigue to this conference on the New Zealand experience. As one thinks about the choices that a state like the state of Nuevo León and Mexico itself is facing, there are different alternatives out there in the world, and it seems that the public sphere would have to be dominated by frustration, would have to be dominated by the failures of different alternatives to try to reform and to try to allow for the great capacities of a society to grow and to flourish and to develop. And then it is not very frequent when one has the opportunity to speak and to listen to someone who was one of the key architects and one of the key participants in the transformation of a national economy as successfully and as dramatically as the New Zealand case was and has been over the last couple of decades. The Honorable Maurice McTigue is a Vice President for Outreach now at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and he was a former cabinet member and member of parliament in his native New Zealand, and one of the prime architects of the New Zealand miracle. This is at a time in which a few of you might not have even been born, but New Zealand was in the brink of catastrophe. Its debt was remarkably large. Its government sector was very large as well. Taxes were over 60% of income, and yet everyone seemed to be convinced that New Zealand was destined to economic and developmental failure. And over the last 2 decades, with the participation of a number of elements in the New Zealand political landscape, and Maurice McTigue being one of them, a prominent one of them, they were able to significantly transform the public sector in New Zealand, to reduce taxes, to reduce debt, to increase productivity, to increase wealth, to reduce a lack of access to services, and to show, indeed, that sometimes the best way to reform and to allow a society and an economy to flourish goes through the way of eliminating certain areas of government participation. As one looks at political and policy debates today, it would seem to be the case that the only alternative is to make some of the things that the government does better. And I think the New Zealand experience shows us that this is just one of the alternatives, and there are other alternatives, and that one has to allow for certain tasks in government, but one also has to look judiciously at what government should not do. It is a wonderful opportunity for us to have Professor McTigue here. He will be speaking in English. He will be leading this conference. We will allow for his presentation, and then we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. Again, it is a pleasure for us to welcome him. And again, I would like to thank the government of the state of Nuevo León and Dr. Enrique Lozano for being here with us. And without further ado, and the minute I give him the microphone, Professor McTigue will be speaking. I would like you to please give him a welcome with a round of applause. Thank you. So, if you don't mind, let me put this just right there. You should be good. Excellent. We can put it.
Well, thank you to the Dean, and thank you to those who invited me to be here, and thank you for the opportunity of talking to young people, as I'm one of the old people now. Next week I will have my 75th birthday, and I can tell you that things don't work as well as they did when I was 25. I'm going to talk to you about some of the experiences that I've had both in my own home country of New Zealand and in other places around the world. But I want to start by just trying to make something clear. We talk about government, that is the institution. I want to talk about governance, that's the process by which we govern. The editor of The Economist magazine, when he retired last year, he wrote a book and it's called The Fourth Revolution. It's worth reading, it's not very long. But in that, one of the things that he postulated was that the successful countries of the 21st century will be those countries that get governance right. And I think that he is right about that. Technology today is going to enable us to do lots of things that we couldn't do before. So the idea that you can govern in secrecy is a redundant idea. The idea that you can use things like crowdsourcing to be able to have a widespread public impact into legislation before you pass it is something that legislatures need to learn about and do something about. But having that kind of contribution into the governing process is going to be better for all of us. So, my country went through a period of time when it was actually the second or third wealthiest country in the world. From the early 1900s through until 1953, it was the second wealthiest country in the world. By the time we got to the early 80s, we dropped to about number 29 or 30 in the economic freedom of the world rankings. So we had gone backwards very dramatically. But first, just to give you an idea, I'm going to go through sort of a quick tour of New Zealand and just explain a little bit about it. So this is New Zealand. The first thing that you'll notice is that there's nobody else close. And that's literally very true, as the slide later on will show you. The different colours on that map are the provinces that were established by the British government when they colonised in the 1840s. And they were centres of governance or government. And none of those exist any longer. They've all gone. One of the things that we do is that we have a tendency to get ourselves over-governed. And we don't rely upon people being able to make ideas work for themselves and take responsibility for making decisions, but also take responsibility for making mistakes as well. Often the governing process is about trying to make people or prevent people from making mistakes. If we don't make mistakes, we never make anything. I love the story about Thomas Edison. And somebody said to him, when he got to about the 10,000th different light bulb that he'd tried, and they said, aren't you disappointed or discouraged by all of that failure? He said, none of it was failure, all of it was a learning experience, and I learned that those things didn't work. That's the kind of attitude that we need to have, that if what we did before doesn't work, then let's find a better way. So if you go to the north of New Zealand, the next place you strike is Southeast Asia, and it's about 8,000 miles away. If you go to the west of New Zealand, you get to Australia, but at the closest point, that's about 3,000 miles away. If you go to the south, the closest place is Antarctica, and that's about 8,000 miles away. And if you go to the east, you run into some of the Pacific Islands. These are Maori people. And lots of people think of Maori people as being the native people of New Zealand. They're not. They're actually immigrants like us, except they came a long time before us. They actually came from Hawaii. And they came from Hawaii about 980 AD. You think of what kind of a journey that was. During that journey. They settled all of the islands like the Samoas and the Cook Islands and Rarotonga and a whole lot of those Pacific islands. It took them 40 years to get from Hawaii to New Zealand. Some of the things we don't know. They knew in about 940 AD when they left that New Zealand existed, but we don't know how they knew. And they called it the land of the long white cloud. It was called Aotearoa. They also knew it wasn't Australia, and the rest of us hadn't even discovered those places at that time. The third thing that was unique about them was that they could actually navigate by the stars, and that's how they got from place to place. This is just a typical photo of what New Zealand would look like if you were a pastoral farmer. We use much of this land for the raising of sheep and cattle. And as you can see, it's quite picturesque, but it's also green. The other thing that you would notice if you were in New Zealand is that the air is particularly clear. And that's because there's nobody else close to us. So there's no particulate pollution in the air, and you can see on a good day for 100 miles. If you notice with this photo, you can see an exact replica of the mountains in the water of the lake below. And that's not unusual. The other thing you would find is the water is crystal clear as well. And that's because nowhere are we very far from the sea, so you don't get the tannin build up in the waters that you get in other places, so our water tends to be crystal clear. Well, these were all things I didn't notice until I left New Zealand. That's the tallest mountain in New Zealand. It's called Mount Cook after the person who discovered New Zealand, Captain Cook. Well, he didn't quite discover it. He was the first to circumnavigate it and map it. But you'll see the other name beside it, Aorangi. And we use both languages. They're both official languages, and I think that that's something important to do. You've got to be culturally sensitive. And Aorangi in English actually means cloud piercer. So pretty smart name to give a mountain. One of the other things that happened that was pretty important was that the early settlers that came from England tended to come from provincial England. And one of the things that they didn't like was the privileges that went to the elites. So some of the things that they did was that they made the decision right at the beginning that the beach belongs to everybody. You can't build on it. So you don't see vast hotels and playgrounds built on the beach. You've got to build back from the beach, and everybody can use it. The same with the banks of the rivers and places like that. They were all decided that they would be common property. Pretty smart thing to do, and something that lots of other places probably wish that they'd done many years ago. I'll challenge you to see if you can pronounce the name. It's Maori, and it says Tani Mahuta. And Tani Mahuta in Maori means God of the forest. That tree was growing there 20 years before Christ was born. So we have some very old forest, and we had a lot of rainforest, and unfortunately the early stages of settlement we decimated much of it. You can't notice it there, but if you measured that tree you would find that it is 30 meters around. So they are huge. This is where I worked for a number of years. This is New Zealand's Parliament buildings. The low flat building is the actual Parliament, the legislature. The round building at the end is the executive building, and it's called the Beehive because it looks like a beehive. It was the creation of one of our Prime Ministers who was pretty strong on the idea of limited government. And they needed to build a new executive building, and he decided that if you built a round one, nobody could make it bigger, so that theoretically you would control the size of government. Well, it didn't work. So now, moving away from these things, that's just a little bit of background of New Zealand. Here's a quote from one of my favorite Americans, Thomas Jefferson, and he said, "I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them." He was a pretty smart person, and that often happens, that we waste a lot of the resources of the nation under the pretext of trying to take care of people, and we might be just better if we left them alone and let them do things on their own. Also just want to tell you another story because it leads into some of the things that I'm going to say. Gordon Tullock, who was an economist at George Mason University, a very famous economist, and he died a few years ago. And he used to put a test to his students the beginning of each year, and the test was this. So I have a policy proposal. It will save 20,000 lives. It will reduce emissions and pollution by 20%. It will save the government thousands and thousands of dollars. And it will reduce the cost of insurance by 75%. Would you vote for it? So I'm not going to ask you to vote for it. But in most instances, people put their hands up and said, yeah, that sounds really good. Well, the proposal was that you put governors on every car and you limited them to being able to travel no more than 40 miles an hour. So when you find the rest of the answer, it doesn't look like such a good idea. And in public policy, we've got to be careful that we've got all the evidence on the table before we make decisions. And we often make decisions on an emotional basis without having all of the facts on the table, and that leads to major problems. Okay. Here's some of the history leading into the reforms of my country, and I want to make a few sort of distinctions right at the start that was driving some of this. Accountability was terrible, because accountability was built around having to account for what you spent money on. So that sounds sort of reasonable, and it's what most governments do. But let's put that in the private sector. If you were investing in a company and all they had to do was tell you where they spent money, but they didn't have to tell you if they made a profit or a loss, if their prospects were better or worse, what would you do? And the answer is you wouldn't invest in them. So what's often missing from the equation in terms of accountability for government is what was the result. And governments were very bad, and still are very bad, at measuring those results. They're also very bad at disclosing them, because it might be embarrassing. Well, that's something that we've got to get over, because you and I, the people who really employ those governments, need to be able to tell, did you do a good job or a bad job? And that's the transparency part. And the technology now makes it possible for us to have much greater transparency. We can know on a day-to-day basis where our government organisations are spending money. Every government organisation, from the federal government down to the lowest level of local government, should be required to put its spending online in real time and allow you to see. I worked with a country in Slovakia, sorry, not a country in Slovakia, a country called Slovakia, as it came out of communism. And one of the interesting things that they did was that they put government spending online, and then they made it interactive so that you could go through the government spending and you could delete the things that you didn't like. And when you went through and you finished by it, you could add in things too if you wanted to, more money on education or on welfare or something like that. You could add those things in, but you could play around with it. And in the end, it printed out for you something that looked like a receipt from a cash register. And it told you how much your taxes would now be if you made those changes. So what it was really doing was allowing people to participate in the ideas of, some of these changes are real to me. And it would be good if I knew how real that was. So disclosure or transparency is very important. I know that you'll know these things, but I'm going to run through them very quickly. When we do something, we start with things that are called inputs. Those are the things that we need to use to actually get the job done. So if it's cleaning up the yard from the fall leaves, it's tools and it's labour. And what they produce is an output, and that is that the leaves have gone. But what they also produce is an outcome, and that is sometimes more difficult to define, but it might be happiness for the people who live there because their home now looks better. It may be that it saves some of the other plants from being killed by the residue of the leaves. So it could be environmental. But getting to identifying those outcomes is really important. I'm going to work on some of those things as we go through this process. So, accountability and transparency. One of the things that New Zealand had was poor levels of accountability. And part of it was that it didn't actually handle the measurement of what it did with money very well. It used the government accounting systems, which most governments do. And what you can't do with that is that you can't actually find out what anything really costs. And you certainly can't find out what it costs per outcome. So how much does it cost per person placed back into work? How much does it cost per person with a graduate degree? You need to know that to be able to make choices between, I'd rather spend money on this program than that program because it gives us better results and at a better cost. So one of the things that we needed to do was convert the whole of the government to full accrual accounting, and also to make the government account in exactly the same way as a business accounts in the private sector. And one of the reasons for doing that is that if you use cash accounting systems, they don't identify liabilities. So it might be nice when the government gives you a guarantee for your business, but it's a hidden cost. It's a liability, because one day that might fold and the guarantee will be called and you, the taxpayer, will have to pay up. So being able to identify those liabilities is very important. I don't know how bad it is in Mexico, but in the United States, right across the 50 states, governments had done a terrible job of managing public sector pensions, the pensions of the people who had worked for them, and mainly because they cheated on the actuarial studies so that they could make it look like the pension was sound, and they used the money for other purposes. You couldn't get away with that in the private sector, but you can get away with it in the public sector. So then in the end it became clear that most of the pension schemes were only funded to about 50%. And when some of the municipalities went bankrupt in the last 2 or 3 years, people who were on public pensions found that they got about 50% of what they'd been owed. Real cases. So having sound accounting principles and having it in a way that we can understand liabilities is really important. So what do we do? Governments actually have things that are delivery organisations. We call them departments or ministries or the agencies or whatever, but they're really delivery organisations. Well, the first question you need to ask is, does the government actually need to do the delivery on that task? Could somebody else do it as well, or even better? So those were some of the questions that we asked, and we went to every government agency, and I'm just going to go through a couple and show you what happens, and we looked very critically at what they were doing. And we did that by finding the hardest people we could around the world who did mergers, acquisitions and reconstructions in the private sector. And we said to them, go into that particular agency and look at what it's doing. Find out what its core business is, what it's required to do by law, and find everything that fits within that criteria and anything that doesn't, terminate it. And so we went through and we did that across all of the organisations. One of the things that governments also do, or government organisations do, is that they love to acquire assets. And you find that you own a lot of things that never get used. I'd be prepared to guarantee that nobody in Mexico actually knows how much land the Mexican government owns, and nor does the Mexican government know how much land it owns. And you could probably take that down to each municipality and still find the answer nobody actually knows. So one of the things that we did, it's a cute accounting trick. We introduced something that's called a capital charge. So when you do the budget of the department, you charge them for the capital that they're using, that's on their balance sheet. And you fund them for that charge for the capital that they're actually using, but you don't fund the part that they're not using. But they still have to pay that money back to the Treasury. In 2 or 3 years, we had billions of dollars of assets that were surrendered back to the government for sale because the agencies didn't want them any longer. So we tried for years to make them surrender capital assets that they weren't using. As soon as they had to pay for them, they surrendered them. So getting the incentives right is often a very smart thing to do. So if we go on to the next one, here's one of the departments, and I use this one because transportation is very important to New Zealand, as you'll see from the next slide, but also because everybody understands transportation. And what we did was that we went into this Department of Transportation. We did exactly what I just outlined. We looked at what its job was, every single thing that it did, and whether or not it should still be done there. So to give you an example, some of the things that came up was driver licensing. So everybody needs a license to drive, and the Transportation Department normally does that. But then for some reason they require you to renew your driver's license. And they said to us that they needed more money for that because they weren't recovering the full cost. So we said to them, why do we do it? And they said, well, everybody has to have a driver's license. We said, but why do we do the renewal? And they said, well, to see that everybody's competent to drive. So what part of this process of renewing the license tests the competency of the driver? Nothing. So why do we do it? And the answer was they didn't have a good answer. So what we did was give people lifetime driver's licenses that they don't renew until they're 74, after which they have to get a health certificate each year to say they're still fit to drive. So there was a whole part of that department we didn't need any longer. And that's why you'll see up there that driver's licenses are now issued by the Automobile Association. And every 5 years they've got a tender for that contract, and if they didn't put in the best contract, it would go to somebody else. So this was just a process. Yet it was something that really annoyed the public, and it's something that had no value. So nowadays, of course, you've got to renew the photo on the driver's license every 10 years for security reasons. Can we just go back a bit? So the answer there was that this department, with 5,600 people working for it, finished up with 53 people working for it. As different activities were identified, shifted back to the private sector, moved to different people who could do it, moved back to the industries that should actually be doing it. You see, you don't actually have to fitness tests on vehicles. You don't have to have a government agent do that. A mechanic can do that. All you need to do is audit their work to see that they do it well. And we can do that very easily, but it doesn't require anywhere near the cost or the manpower. So, one of the reasons why transportation was important to us is this. You can see how far it is from us to anybody. So being efficient at transporting stuff and getting the costs as low as we could was very important. And given that most of our exports are land-based exports, they're quite bulky, so transportation becomes an even bigger factor. Yep. Also, you can get efficiency gains. This was one of my ministries. It was called the Ministry of Works. What it actually did was public works. It built bridges, it built schools, it built hospitals, it built roads, it repaired roads, it resurfaced them, it did all of those things. And it had 28,000 people working for it. But when you looked at that critically and said, what does this do? It was a construction company. And the government doesn't need a construction company. It can get plenty of people in the private sector that can do that work for it. So that's what we did. We got rid of all of the construction part, which meant that we had one person left instead of 28,000. And what that actually did was that we used the same quantity of money, but we were able to do 40% more work now that it went out to competitive tender in the private sector. That 40% more work meant that the people working in that sector, the number of people working went up by 25%. So we got a lot more jobs for the same quantity of money, a lot more value. And they did some things that were really smart. One of the things that annoys us most is that when you go somewhere, there's construction work. And it blocks the traffic and it slows everybody down. One of the things that they did on some of their projects was that they said maximum disruption, minimum time. So when it came to resurfacing a road or repairing it, they would close the road. and you would see those milling machines that dress the surface of the road. You'd see them 5 wide. And behind that they would have the asphalt trucks laying the paving again, and behind that you would have the people putting the white lines down again. And the last time I was home, I went into the city of Christchurch, and I forgot that there was construction going on, and I had to take detours and so forth, and it was annoying. And then when it was time to leave, I'd been in the town about 4 or 5 hours, I forgot about the construction again and went back. But lo and behold, it was all finished. The lines were back on the road, it was all sealed, it was beautiful. Now that was just thinking about it differently. Now you think about that, think of the efficiency gains of having that work 24 hours a day with all of the equipment in place at the same time, without people ever having to move out of the way for rush hours, and all that happens is that you're disrupted for 1 day or 2. Smart thing to do. We get smart ideas from the private sector. We don't get a lot of smart ideas from the public sector, because there would be people complaining that I had to use a detour. Well, I'd rather use the detour if it was only for 2 days than having to cope with that construction for weeks at a time. So the next bit is actually about how you think through some of the public policy issues. And I've actually picked here one that has some environmental connotations. And it's how you manage forests. So what we used to do with forests, some of them were national parks, and of course there was no forestry at all in those, and they were managed by the government, they stayed managed by the government. But others were production forests where there would be cutting, and what happened was that when the trees got to maturity, the government would sell the trees to a forester, and the forester would move in and cut them, and might take 4 or 5 years to go through and remove the stand. It was normally clear felling. The public went nuts about it. They did nothing when they left, because their job was to maximize the value of it, and they maximized that by taking it as quickly as possible and converting it into cash in the quickest manner possible. So when we started to think about that, all of the incentives were bad. So let me put it to you this way. If you own a car, you look after it in a certain manner. If you lease a car, you look after it, but not quite as well if you own it. And if you rent a car, you don't really care a hell of a lot. If you could change those incentives so that my interest was over a much longer period of time, everything else might change too. So instead of selling 5-year cutting contracts for mature trees, we sold 100-year cutting contracts to a forest. And the whole of the management moved over to the new owner of that forest. Now if I own it, the last thing I want to do is have it burned down. The second thing I want is I want to maximize its production. And the third thing I want to do is I want to maximize the value of that production. So by making that one change, we got billions of dollars from the industry for these assets. The number of people working in the forests, even though we took the Ministry of Forestry from 17,000 people to 17, the people working in the forestry sector went up by 30%. Because now the owners wanted to maximize the value. They did more silviculture work, they did more work to maximize the growth rate of the trees. And then they also did something else that we tried in lots of ways to get them to do, and that is to convert it into finished products or closer to finished products, value adding. Now they had a known quantity of product for 100 years at a known price. And they immediately put on all of that further processing to be able to add that value. So you've got these kind of things that the amount of timber harvested went down by about 20%, but its value went up by about 80%, and we got a 30% gain in the people who were employed in the industry. So what I'm really saying is we have to think in the real world of how the world works, how we can make government policy fit into that, and how we can get better results. The interesting thing is that we used to have forest fires, a bit like they do in the United States. It's now about 30 years since we started selling these long-term cutting rates. In that period of time, not one of those forests has had a forest fire. Why? They actually use satellites to detect fires before they become anything. They use all of the modern technology because the last thing you want to do was have this valuable asset burned down. They replant as they cut so that they maximize the regeneration and they get the new trees growing as quickly as possible. You don't get the eyesores that you used to have. There's all sorts of environmental outcomes that the erosion, a lot of this being on hillsides, that you get from clear felling disappears if you only take about 80% of the trees at a time and replant and then take the other 20% a few years later when the new trees have established. All sorts of things that come because now I've got an interest in maximizing the value of this and I'm going to look after it. I could tell you exactly the same story using the same principles to change the way in which we manage the deep sea fisheries with exactly the same results. So only 2 countries in the world use property rights to manage fisheries, New Zealand and Iceland. They're the only 2 places in the world that have ocean fisheries that are recovering while the rest are being further decimated. So thinking smart is really important. Agriculture was our biggest industry, and agriculture was subject to a whole lot of government intervention and a lot of things that the government did to try and make it more profitable for farmers and to try and maintain farming the way it had been 50 and 100 years ago. And what we really found was that none of this made farming very prosperous, nor did it make it very innovative or creative. And when you think about giving somebody a subsidy, what does that actually do? You give them a subsidy because you're trying to distort their decision making to make them do something differently. So it's not their first choice. So the second thing is you make them focus on you to see that they do everything to qualify for the subsidy. And that's often contrary to the best interests of their business. So subsidies came to about 45% of a farmer's income, and we took them all away in 1 year. And there were a lot of very unhappy farmers. But what happened was that they started to change. A couple of years on, they started to change what they were doing. And at that time, sheep meat was our biggest export from the land. And most of that sheep meat went in the form of lamb carcasses. And the incentives were created in such a way that the farmer got the subsidies for maximizing the number of sheep that they produced. Well, if there's a given quantity of feed in a given area and you put more animals on it, well, only one thing's going to happen: they're going to be smaller. So they got smaller and smaller. And we used to call it the skinny sheep program. And it finished up that our sheep meats finished up competing with goat meat in the Middle Eastern markets, the lowest value markets in the world. We took the subsidies away, and all of a sudden the farmers had to say to themselves, who will pay us the most for this product? And at that time they were getting about $12.50 a carcass from the marketplace. 4 years later they were getting $110 a carcass from the marketplace, because now it went into the best of the restaurant trade and it went into the best of the supermarket trade in the world and went into all of the high price markets. So their value of their product went up tenfold by taking their subsidy away. So one of the other things that subsidies do is that they kill off innovation. And innovation is what gives us a great big gain. So the last thing I'm going to say here is, just look at this one down here where it talks about dairy. Under subsidies, New Zealand dairy farmers produce 35 products from milk. And you know, when you think about milk, there's not a hell of a lot you can do with it. You can drink it, you can convert it into powder, you can make it into a few different things, and cheeses and so forth, but not a lot. Last year they made 2,200 products, different products from milk. That's innovation and creativity that comes from customizing what you're doing and of course increasing the value of it. So one of the other things that subsidies had done was that they had killed off that innovation. What we're going to need in the new economies of the world, we're going to need to maximize innovation and creativity. We want wealth coming from brains. That's why you're here. And we need to unleash that. It also means we're going to make some mistakes. And Okay, I'll leave that there. Okay, so that just shows you how dominant land-based products and sea-based products were in the New Zealand economy. On the far side, you've got other at 17%, steel and minerals at 11%, and machinery electrical at 7%. The rest comes from the ocean or the land. So we were very dependent upon being able to make these things work well. And that's one of the ways of making them work well. I'm going to shift to one of the social areas now. And this is education reform. Everybody around the world has had problem with their formal schools. And they have been dissatisfied with how good they have been at educating particularly little children through to secondary school. We had exactly the same problem. Sometimes you get the answers by asking the most simple of questions. And the question we asked was, if our schools were once good and now they're not, what changed? And that's true in most countries. If our schools were once good and now they're not, what changed? And the answer was the governance of the schools changed. Once schools were run by parents who responded to other parents as consumers of education and did what they thought was necessary. Somewhere from the 50s onwards, we created vast bureaucracies to run schools because parents wouldn't know what to do. Well, frankly, that's been a disaster. The other thing was that those vast bureaucracies cost a lot of money. In our case, when we went and measured that, for every dollar spent on education, 67 cents was being spent outside of the classroom. And we thought we were spending it on kids. So putting more money in to do better for kids wasn't going to do very much good because it wasn't actually being spent on kids. So what we actually did was that we made every school in the country a standalone school, governed by a board of trustees. And the board of trustees was elected by the parents of the children who went to that school. Nobody else got a vote. The government collected all the money and it paid it to the schools on a per capita grant. If you got more children, you got more money. If you had less children, you got less money. So we went from being around number 26 or 27 in the world in terms of educational attainment to being about number 4, 5 or 6. And we've been there for the last 20 years. And that was really changing the governance because it made it responsive to the consumers of education who are actually parents. Reforming the budget. So budgets are the things that make governments work, and to most of us they're a mystery because we don't understand, and they use huge quantities of money and they count millions or sometimes billions of dollars have been margin of error calculations. You don't have to worry about them, but if it was mine I'd be worrying about it, and it wouldn't have to get that high before I'd worry about it. In fact, it wouldn't get that high, I'd be in debtor's jail long before that. So what we needed to do was look at that whole budget process and to do some things that can put some pressure on being better at looking after the resource. So in the private sector, how you actually make gains and how you improve the prosperity of your company is productivity gains. And we expect productivity gains of between 3 and 4% per annum continuously. Sometimes by using new process, sometimes by innovation, sometimes by using robotics, whatever it is, but we look for that. In the public sector, we didn't. So we decided that we were going to take a productivity gain out of everybody's budget every year. So the operating budget of each agency, they would tell us what it was for the year before. So what they got was 98% of that. 2% went as a productivity gain. They had to do the same with that much less money because you could do that in the private sector. And after all, we were picking the best of the people around the country to actually do this work, so they should be able to achieve that. Governments had to actually produce proof of results. If you couldn't prove what you achieved last year in outcome terms, you got no money. So if you were doing work with remedial reading, you had to show how many children you'd lifted to being able to read at their real age. If it was in healthcare, you had to show how much you had improved the wellness of people from this program. and if it was an economic development, you had to show how much your actions had increased economic growth in that particular community or that sector. So, not unreasonable things to do, but the consequence was if you couldn't show that, you didn't get any money. One of the other things that budgets do is that they tend to give to an agency an allocation of money to spend. That's like giving your children pocket money and expecting them to save it, but knowing that they're going to go straight to the candy store and spend it. So what we did was that we started to change appropriations, the allocation of money, to a purchase agreement that was very specific. And this is a purchase agreement for one of my ministries. It was the Ministry for Employment. And it used to fund 34 programs, and it would give so much money to each program. So what we did was that we converted it to a purchase agreement, and it gave exactly the same quantity of money. But now it said you have to place 120,000 people into work. 56% of them have to be long-term unemployed. 25% of them have to be Maori people. 14% have to be people with disabilities. And 7% have to be people with social problems. It's got to be available right across the country, but it's got to be accented in the places that need it most. It doesn't mention one program. So we went from 34 programs to 4. And what we got was 130,000 people into work for 40% less money. Because what you're doing is that you're concentrating on using the tools that work best. Now, the chief of my ministry, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, he had to sign this purchase agreement, and if he didn't achieve those things, he had to resign. So there was a consequence for not doing it. Now, if okay, something serious happened, we might give them some reconsideration, but there was a consequence. The interesting thing was, we hardly ever had somebody who did not achieve what was in their purchase agreement. Different way of looking at things. When we buy something, we know what we expect to get. When we just give money out, we're not too sure. We just think it's going to a good cause, but we're not sure what we're getting. That needs to change. How you gather revenue is really important, and more revenue systems are becoming international competitive issues. And you need to be able to gather it in a way that's less harmful to your economy than it is to your neighbours. One of the bad things that we do with revenue systems is that we have for a long time had what's called revenue spending. And it happened a long time ago because it was easier to give somebody a tax credit than it was to write them a cheque. And it was because the transaction costs of writing cheques were so high that we started to use credits. So we started to use the revenue system for delivering social policy and for delivering economic incentives. The problem is that nobody actually pays very much attention to this kind of spending, where they do pay a lot of attention to all of the real spending where you have to pay out the dollars. So part of this reform was to say that all of that goes. There will be no tax credits, and there'll be no social policy, and there'll be no economic policy through the tax system. The first thing that does is that it makes it very simple, because you've taken away all of the things that made it complicated before. It meant that 67% of New Zealanders didn't have to fill out tax returns any longer, because your source deductions as a wage and salary earner were so close to accurate you didn't need to do anything. We moved all of that other stuff over to the spending side. So if you needed housing support, you would get a housing benefit. If you needed low-income family support, you would get low-income family support. But it was targeted and it was income tested. So if you're above average income, you didn't get it. It had phased out. The other thing with these incentives or these credits was that you gave them to everybody, which meant that you were wasting money on people that you didn't need to waste it on. So by doing that, we were able to dramatically change the revenue system and make it much more competitive. Something that we really need to think about, because government should actually do at least these two things. You should stop spending money on things that don't work. That's pretty obvious. But giving money to people who don't need it is something that doesn't work. take less from them in the first place and give it to somebody else who does need it, but maybe not quite so much. And you should buy goods and services from the best providers. Those two things that we do badly. Okay, the last thing, government-owned businesses. Over the years, governments get involved in a hell of a lot of business, and government should never be in the business of being in competition with its own citizens in the marketplace. That's a quote from Margaret Thatcher, as she started about going about privatisation in the United Kingdom. People in government sometimes think that they can run these things better than people in the private sector. They are wrong. You only have to look at the rates of return and how much they cost. Nobody would employ them in the private sector to do those jobs. So they're wrong about that. In addition to that, they are often anti-competitive in that one of the ways that the government makes it work is to stop anybody from competing with them. The way we control prices and encourage innovation is to have competition. So the more competition there is, the more innovation there's going to be and the lower prices will be. So getting the government out of business is a really important thing to do. So I was involved in privatising 35 different enterprises, and once you'd done it, nobody really noticed. You know, when we privatised the post office, or semi-privatised the post office, and we had to close down 2/3 of the post offices because the post offices were all in the wrong place. They had been built 60 or 70 years ago when that's where the centre of the city was. And the city had developed and moved and there's hardly anybody there, so you had to make a special journey to go to the post office. That was pretty stupid. And the service in the post office was terrible because there was no competition. So we said, okay, non-viable post offices will close down. But within a year, you could buy postal services at 3 times as many places. Because you buy them at the supermarket. You could buy them in the bookstore, you could buy them, anybody who got a contract to provide postal services, you could buy them there. It was where you were doing your other business. And the post office became viable. It went from 33 years of making losses to immediately making profits, and it's made profits every year since. At the same time, the cost of postage went down. So these are some of the things that you really have to think through and say, that might be a nice tradition, doesn't work today. And if you're competing with Google, the post office doesn't shape up too good. So looking for better ways of doing it. So the final bit, these are some of the results. We went from 19% inflation to 2%. We had an economy that was growing at 4 to 5%. It used to grow at about 0.5 to 1% per annum. Unemployment dropped from 11% to 4%. The budget was balanced. And we ran surpluses for 16 years in a row, and we used them to pay off most of our debt. The government's share of GDP dropped from 44% to 26%. That's governments at all levels, so federal, municipal, local. And the government workforce was reduced by 66%. And it sort of worked, because you can see from this last slide that if you compared where we are with the European community, New Zealand gets a little green box, and so do the other countries that are growing at between 2 and 4%. The rest of the European community doesn't do too well. And in the end, what you want is growth. Growth is the magic thing that creates jobs and improves prosperity. And too few times the governing process asks the question about what will this do for growth? What will this do for our competitiveness? Okay, thank you everybody. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Before I give the floor to our audience, I will just make a couple of comments, and then I'll allow them to make questions about your presentation. It is not very common that we see in our classrooms in economics departments and departments of government and political science that we see, let alone scholars who are consistent with the public choice school of economics and organization, it is even less common when we have practitioners who have actually put some of those principles to work. And I think it is very useful that we have this perspective and that your conference actually looks directly at how some of these principles as being put into work make a big difference. Let me ask you or address a couple of questions that I think would be interesting before I allow the rest of the folks to ask their questions. Reduction of government allows for a great opportunity of unleashing of activity by the private sector, but it also entails a significant regulatory challenge in terms of allowing some of these private sector activities to conform or to actually lead towards the public good that is desired. So I would like to hear a little bit of what New Zealand did and what you think your best perspective to address those regulatory challenges is. And I'll leave it at that because I'd rather listen to some of the questions that the rest of the audience has.
Okay, I'll try and keep this as short as I can. One of the things that regulators never have to do is that they never have to answer the question, what will your proposal do for investment in the economy, and what will your proposal do for job creation? Because if they're negative, we don't want your regulation. And very often they are negative. The second thing, we regulate a whole lot of things that we don't need to regulate, and it's more about protecting privileged interests than it is about protecting our safety. So most places around the world license hairdressers. Look, if you don't know when you've got a bad haircut or a good haircut, you shouldn't be out on the street on your own. That's just silly. We have a whole lot of stuff that we regulate, and we regulate it because some powerful interests persuaded somebody to put regulations in place, when we should just allow anybody who wants to cut hair can go cut hair. And if they do it really badly, they're not going to stay in business very long. The same sort of thing around cosmetics, and then a whole range of different things in terms of occupational licensing that you could just wipe out instantaneously. One of the things that we did, because you asked how we did it, we rewrote most of New Zealand's statutes. And what we did was that we went through the Crimes Act and the Commerce Act and all of them, and we rewrote them because over time bits get added, and as bits get added they become confusing and contradictory. And we decided it was time that we tidied them up. So our environmental laws measured 48 inches if you stack them up. And we rewrote those and we got them down to 384 pages, about that big. And that's because you took all of the confusing parts away. It means that it's less litigious. But when we did that, we repealed all of the old legislation. And when you repealed that, you killed every single regulation that had been written under that old law, and you had to do new ones to meet the needs of the new law. So we got rid of about 85% of our regulations by doing that, but we got regulations that were more meaningful and they were more appropriate to the industry because the law itself was now clearer. Many regulations are written to try and see that my agency keeps what it's doing because your agency is trying to encroach on it. And it makes it very complicated, and it makes it very difficult for people just to comply. Regulations also kill small business. And when I talk about small business, I'm talking about the 1 to 10 employee business, where they don't have the capacity to be able to do the compliance, and they finish up getting in trouble, or they don't even try, and they finish up getting in trouble. So clearing the decks and making it simpler and easier is a good thing to do. Okay.
Question from the audience.
Kia ora, Koranta Koinua, and I lived in New Zealand for a while, and it's a pleasure to have you here and have the opportunity to listen what the government of New Zealand did. several years ago. However, I haven't heard anything about inequality. According to the OECD, both Mexico and New Zealand have had some problems with inequality during the past couple of decades, and according to a quite recent study from the OECD, New Zealand has lost about 15 percentage points of its GDP due to inequality during from 1995 to 2010. I would like to hear your opinion about what the government of New Zealand did with regards to inequality, and if something else could have been done better. Thank you.
We have a couple more questions. We might take them right now, or you can go ahead.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, but I'd be very happy if somebody could explain to me exactly what inequality means, because it's a matter of a different set of processes in most people's brains. If equality means that everybody turns out exactly the same, I don't want that. That's what we tried with communism, and it was terrible. So what we have to allow is a certain amount of individual determination for people. So is there equality of opportunity? I think the answer to that is yes. Does everybody make the same of opportunity? No. Does everybody try the same things? No. So they're not going to say they get the same results. It's a bit like saying to the Soccer Federation in Mexico, we want you to still play soccer, but we don't want you to count the goals, because we want everybody to finish up equal. The world doesn't work like that. So I have a rather jaundiced view of a lot of those studies. Now, what happens in terms of earnings, which is a lot of the stuff coming from Piketty's book. One of the things that Piketty does in his book that I think is just totally wrong is that he takes a moment in time, like right now, and he measures everybody in the quintile compared to each other. But if we're going to measure something like equality and inequality, we should actually measure my lifetime. Because when I first start work, I actually expect that I'm going to start somewhere close to the bottom of the earning scale. And at some time in my life, I hope that I'm going to get up into the top quintile, or maybe even to the top 1%. But I know I'm not going to stay there. So that's very mobile. And nobody's done the work to actually look at what happens to people over their life, rather than what happens to a whole lot of numbers that are compared on one day at a time. So if you're in those numbers, and if we make the comparison today and tomorrow you get a 25% raise in salary, where does it put you? You see, if we measured your life, we would actually get that factored in, and we would get a much better opportunity of measuring inequality. The second thing is, an old priest told me this many years ago, and it's very valid. And it was a Catholic school, and there were all boys in the school, and he said to us, 1955, how many of you want to be millionaires, which was a lot of money in those days? So of course we all stuck up our hands. And he said, well, I'm going to tell you that any one of you who wants to be a millionaire can be, if you're prepared to pay the price. And the price is that you're going to have to start work very young, and you're going to have to work all the time, and you're going to have to work evenings, and you're going to have to work Saturdays and Sundays, and you're going to have to commit yourself totally to making money. You're not going to have time to have a girlfriend, you're not going to have time to get married, but you are going to become a millionaire. And I said to the rest of you, if you don't like that and you make another choice, don't complain about him becoming a millionaire because he paid that price. You might have wanted something else. And he said, I'm not going to tell you whether it's better or not. It may be better, but you're not going to become a millionaire. So you make those choices, and you have to live with the consequences of them. To try and do something in a public policy way to stop us from doing that, I think would be catastrophic for societies. I hope I'm not intimidating people. Because after this you've got a lot of stuff that you've got to go and fix.
I have a question regarding you said you reduced the government size from 17,000 to 17. What happened to those people that they were prepared to be in public service, and once they're gone, what happened?
Really good question. So it's a bit like a company that finishes up growing very quickly and finds that it's lost market share with one of its products, and has to make some hard decisions about, does it have to lay people off? Didn't want to do that, but having made some bad decisions, or somebody else having made better decisions, they're placed with that situation. So you have to deal with that fact that working for the government isn't a guarantee of a job for life. Second thing is, governments don't exist to give jobs to civil servants. They exist to deliver goods and services that society needs. And here's what actually happened. So of those 17,000 people, many of them, we helped them to set up businesses that were doing the same things that they did before, but now doing it for the private sector owners. I met with many of those people and found that their earnings were now 2 or 3 times what they were previously. A lot of them worked in the forest, and now they didn't have to work on wet days. Previously they did have to turn up 5 days a week, but it would be 8 till 5. Now they would work on contract, and if it was pruning and things like that, then they now found that when they were working on contract, they could do about 3 times as many trees as they used to in a day. So they got paid about 3 times as much money. But sometimes they were only working 3 or 4 days a week instead of working 5. They found it pretty good. The other thing was that with the further processing, there was a demand for a whole lot of people in new jobs that serviced that further processing. So they were swallowed up in that. And there's one of the things that you should do as a government. You should be a good employer, no question about that. And you should be actually the best employer. So you should look after your people well. And we did that in terms of easing their transition from the government to the private sector. In many instances, we bought people out of their contracts. So in some cases, people were getting the equivalent of a year's salary in one block payment because they'd worked for the government for a long time. And a lot of other people were saying, hell, I would take that if I could get somebody to offer it to me. So we bought them out of their contracts. That gave them an opportunity to get themselves re-established. In other cases, we paid for them to finish their degrees, and we supported them during the period of time that they went from not having a degree to having a master's or a PhD. So we did all of those kind of things, and I sort of glossed through them. But in the end, the important thing was that we went from 11% unemployment to 4% unemployment. And that's equivalent to full employment. So there were plenty of jobs around, and people were able to get relocated. So you do all of those things, but I just didn't make a feature of it up there. But it's a really good question. Aha. I'm like the camel, I need watering.
I was wondering how you dealt with public support for the reduction of governing of the government services, since I'd imagine there would be a lot of people opposed to the reduction of employment there.
Well, you have to get accustomed to things like getting burnt in effigy and having protesters around quite a bit. So, yeah, you do get a lot of pushback. The answer is you think it through carefully before you decide to act. But once you've decided to act, nothing deters you from that course. You get the job done. Because if you don't do that, then you'll get rolled back on everything that you do. The second thing was that we did it quickly. So there were many things that were going through this kind of process at the same time. So it wasn't like you dragged it out over a long period of time. You're looking at a period of about 4 to 5 years to do most of these reforms. So it happened quite quickly. I think that's essential. That's not an economic fact, that's a political fact. You can't hold a coalition of elected representatives together long enough if you're going to drag it out over a long period of time. The third thing was that the results start to appear quite early on. And people say, wow, this is starting to work better. The government doesn't get credit for it, and nor do the ministers, but people start to say, hey, this is working better. Inflation is coming down. When I became a Member of Parliament, inflation was 19%, mortgage interest rates were 25%. You try owning a house when you're paying 25% mortgage. It is just impossible. So seeing those things fixed, they were really the result of a long period of government mismanagement caused those problems. Fixing that helped people start to say, hey, we know it was a mess, there was going to be some pain getting it done, but let's get it done as quickly as possible and then go on. So, no, not easy to do. Here's something that's interesting though. I've looked at similar scale reforms in a lot of places around the world. And the interesting thing is that the reforming government always wins the next election. And it's what I call street smarts. The public out there has street smarts. And they mightn't have degrees, but they know what's right and they know what's wrong. And if you're continuing to spend buckets and buckets of money and borrowing to cover it, people just know that it's wrong and you've got to fix it at some stage. And they buy into it. The second thing is that people follow leadership. And in many instances we're seeing governments that don't show leadership. They're not prepared to set a goal out there and say, this is what I'm going to do. One of my heroes was Margaret Thatcher because I was impressionable at that time. But one of the things that she did in her campaign to become Prime Minister, she said that what I'm going to do is put the great back into Great Britain. And she set about doing that. And even the people who didn't vote for her actually respected her for that. And Winston Churchill once said in politics, it's much better to be respected than liked. And I think he was right, that you have to be respected for taking the tough calls and doing the tough things. Then interestingly, it tends to show up in the ballot box.
We don't have any more questions, so just, there you go, here's another one. We still have a few minutes.
I'm fine, thanks.
Just another question. You said that you leased, for example, the forest or anything that has to do with natural resources. So, how do you decide which company is going to take over the leasing? Or what is the process? Because we have in Mexico contract contest. So how do you determine?
Okay. At the end of the lease, the property has to be returned to the government in similar form to that in which they took it at the time when they bought the lease. So 100 years later, it has to be returned in the same form. At that time, the government can make choices. Either it will lease it again, or it will decide not to lease it, but that choice is still there. To be able to decide who would get the leases, it was part of an international bidding contest. So the particular property was put up with its prospectus and it was advertised around the world, and we took bids from wherever. There's one thing that I think is really important about privatization, and that is that you have to maximize the value of the asset, otherwise what you're doing is not defendable, because you are then selling one of the nation's assets for less than its value. You should never do that. The second thing is that you should make certain that there is competition after the asset is sold, because it's competition that controls prices and moves innovation. And the third thing is keep the government at least at arm's length from the process so that it doesn't get contaminated with accusations of corruption. So all of these negotiations, the only time I was ever likely to see a purchaser was when we signed the final documents. The sale would be concluded and we would sign the final documents. Sometimes I didn't even meet them then because the political process being what it is, it was very easy for it to become contaminated by accusations of preference and privilege and corruption. And one of the interesting things about competition, the competition doesn't actually have to be there, it has to be able to be there. So when we sold the telephone company, it was a monopoly and we sold it to one bidder, which was a consortium from the United States and New Zealand and somewhere else. But at the same time, the market was opened up to any telecommunications company from anywhere in the world to come into the New Zealand market. And that saw the cost of telecommunication services across the whole spectrum over the next 2 years drop by 70%. And it was that threat of competition that did that. Now, I actually think that threat of competition is often more disciplinary than the actual competition when it appears. You're frightened of what this new guy might be like, so you try really, really hard to make certain that he's not going to get into the marketplace, and that's to the benefit of the consumers. When you do these things, the people you should be thinking about is the consumers of goods and services. They need to get a good deal from what you do in the end. It's not about which particular sector of elites, which particular industry gets a good deal out of this. It's what happens to consumers. For consumers, you get the best deal by making certain there's an opportunity for competition. Too much privatization around the world has made some very fundamental mistakes. The first one is that they try and make certain that it's sold to groups within their own country. Bad decision. You're not maximizing the value, you have to push them all the way. And the second one is to provide protection for the new owner. No, he bought it with his eyes open or her eyes open, going to have to take whatever the market does. And if you do those things, then it turns out well. If you don't do those things, it will be a mess forever.
Excellent, thank you. Well, one last question there.
Mr. McTigue, former congressman and minister, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Very glad that you came to share some of your knowledge with us. I just have one question. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've gathered a sense of competition and capitalism and sort of halo among all your answers, which is free enterprise and all these principles, economic principles, as opposed to legal principles, which come more to the communist scope that we have all across Latin America. I was wondering, I follow how you dealt with all these social problems and trying to foster competition in all of them, surviving the market and all this. How do you deal with welfare, and how do you deal with people that are in the low economic bracket and that are fostered to have more children because they would get probably a larger check from food stamps or whatever sort of privileges they get monthly? And would that stop them or hinder them from growing and competing and actually opening their eyes to life and becoming a better, more more competitive people? Because I've seen in the U.S., for example, which is an example we have right across north. There's a lot of people that immigrate to the U.S. to live from welfare,
you guys have this problem, and how have you addressed this?
Okay, really good questions. So let me deal with something that's smaller for a start. You don't make good public policy by concentrating on worst cases. So there are going to be some people who are going to be screw-ups, and they're going to be screw-ups for all of their life. Don't try and design the policy around the screw-ups. You're going to have to pick up their messes regardless of what happens. The second thing, I think that free people making decisions in their own best interest finish up producing the best result. So give them the opportunity to make those decisions, and they will make a better job than some kind of a government agency. The third thing is this: when we think about welfare, there's a tendency to think about it in terms of how can we relieve the consequence of this poor person who has trouble. If all you do is relieve the consequence, what you actually do is embed the dependency for the rest of their life. So if you are hungry and I give you food, I feed you now and I relieve your hunger. And tonight and tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. Now what I've done is that I've alleviated the consequences of your problem. I haven't looked at the cause. What caused you to be hungry? It might be that you can't read or write. It might be that you don't have any social skills. It might be that you don't have any marketable skills. At the same time as I fed you, I should have done something about those things too. And that's one of the things that we did. We looked at the problem here is dependency. How do we move to people from dependency to independent living? And it means solving that underlying problem. So as we gave you welfare, we also require that you attend the community college and get lessons in English, or attend the community college and get some lessons in technology. Whatever it was, we were dealing with some of that underlying problem, so that there's going to be a point in time when that person's going to be able to live on their own resources. That's frequently forgotten. The second part of that is that the outcome from social solutions and the outcome from economic solutions are often different, but the social solutions are preferred because the economic ones are considered to be tough. Well, we should actually give some consideration to the people who are providing the resource for us to be able to do these other things. So one of the things that we did as well was that we said to people, if you just don't like working, that's fine. You don't have to work. But we consider that you're on strike from work, so you don't get any payments. If you're physically able to look after yourself and you don't, then that's your problem, but you don't get any money. So that's the other side of that coin, saying, hey, it's not about just being able to live on entitlement. The last thing is, remember I put up the thing on reforming revenue and shifting spending from the revenue side of the budget to the spending side of the budget, particularly things like transfer payments and credits for children, etc. So prior to that, everybody used to get a family credit, and it was equal to $12.50 a week per child. But everybody got it. It was universal. So when we made these reforms, we decided it wouldn't be universal any longer. We would pay it according to need. And when you got to sort of middle income or upper middle income, according to how many children you had, it would phase out or disappear. So that payment went from being $12.50 a week for people at the bottom end of the scale to somebody who might be getting $48 a week for the first child and $37.50 a week for the subsequent children. But it phases out. So we looked after them much better. The other good thing about shifting that to the spending side was that those payments went to the caregiver of the children, normally the mother. When there are deductions on the revenue side, they're never in cash, and they really go to the earner. So the benefit of paying them to the caregiver was something that was very real and was also very popular, and helped to do a whole lot of things that we couldn't do in other ways. And it also happened to be cash every 2 weeks, instead of something that you got at the end of the year when you filed your tax return. So a whole lot of those things actually work better in terms of delivering social policy. Having been educated by nuns and priests most of my life, one of the things they used to drum into you was, you're responsible for yourself first, and you're responsible for those around you second, and you should only depend on somebody else when you can't do those things for some good reason. And I think everybody else should be like that too. So, you've got to look after yourself. We've got to go back to saying to people, hey, you look after yourself first, and you look after those around you, and you don't have the right to be able to opt out. Unless you like to opt out with no money, you can do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I will just ask you to come over here to sign some of the posters.
Oh, right.
For the conference as a memory of what we have done, and we have a few souvenirs for you as well.
So on the back of these it will say, I owe everybody $10,000.
There you go. I'll stand here so that the picture actually captures them. I see that. Thank you. We'll get to keep one of these, and the rest will be used for Hall of Fame.
Just while I'm signing these, one of the things that I privatized was forests, as I mentioned. And on one occasion, when you sold the forest, the minister had to actually initial every page. So there were 10,000 pages that I had to initial. Wow. It took a long time.
There you go. And this is for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias y despedimos.
Thank you.
Gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Muy buenas tardes. Congrats.